At first, nobody noticed when they stopped answering. The phone still buzzed on the kitchen counter, lighting up a room that had already gone quiet. A missed call from a sibling. A text from an old friend. Another reminder from work, asking for just one more thing. But this time, Gen X did something they were never taught to do. They let it ring. No fight, no speech, no dramatic goodbye. Just silence from the generation that had spent a lifetime showing up for everyone else. They were called independent, resilient, low maintenance, the people who could handle anything. But what if that toughness was never strength? What if it was survival, polished into a personality? And what if the reason they are cutting people off now is not because they became cold? What if they simply got tired of being needed, but never really known? This is where their silence quietly begins. To understand why Gen X is pulling away, you have to understand where America placed them. They were never the loudest generation in the room. They came after boomers, who inherited power, pensions, and the promise of American success. They came before millennials and Gen Z, whose struggles became headlines, hashtags, and endless debates. But Gen X learned to live between attention and expectation. They were the kids with house keys around their necks. The teenagers who figured things out before anyone explained them. The adults expected to work harder, complain less, and keep everything moving. America called them independent because that sounded better than saying they were often alone. And now, in middle age, they are still treated like the generation that needs nothing. Too old to be protected. Too young to be excused. They became America's forgotten middle child, useful, quiet, and almost invisible. Until now. Before Gen X disappeared from people's lives, they learned how to disappear inside their own homes. Many of them grew up in houses where the adults were busy, tired, divorced, or simply absent. The school day ended, but supervision did not begin. They walked home alone, unlocked the door, and stepped into silence. The television became background noise. The microwave became dinner. The house key around their neck became a small medal of survival. Nobody called it loneliness then. They called it independence. They learned not to ask too many questions. They learned not to cry too loudly. They learned that needing help could make them a problem. So they became useful, quiet, funny, sarcastic, and hard to reach. Long before therapy taught people boundaries, Gen X learned boundaries from empty rooms. And when you train a child to need nobody, do not be surprised when the adult finally stops needing everyone. By the time Gen X reached middle age, silence had followed them into responsibility. They became the person everyone called when something broke. A parent's appointment, a child's crisis, a bill that could not wait, a workplace problem no one else wanted to hold. They learned to answer, because people depended on them. But dependence is not the same as care. Everyone knew they were reliable. Fewer people asked if they were lonely. They carried groceries, passwords, medical forms, memories, and family tension. They remembered birthdays while forgetting their own exhaustion. They became the emergency contact, the backup plan, the calm voice in the room. And still, when their own life started cracking, many heard nothing back. No call just to check in. No question that did not come with a request. So they began to understand something painful. Being needed can feel like being loved, until you realize people only notice you when something must be fixed. For Gen X, work was supposed to be the deal that made everything make sense. Show up early, stay late, keep your head down, do not complain, be loyal, and one day, loyalty would return the favor. But somewhere along the way, the deal changed. The pension disappeared, the cost of living climbed. The promotion went to someone cheaper, younger, or easier to reshape. And the person who gave 20 years to a company became a budget problem overnight. Gen X learned that experience could become a liability. They were too young to retire, but too old to be treated as future potential. So they updated resumes in silence. They smiled through meetings while wondering how long they could survive another layoff. The workplace did not just exhaust them. It taught them that being dependable does not mean being protected. Then came the fear waiting at the edge of middle age. Retirement. For Gen X, it did not feel like a reward. It felt like a math problem with no clean answer. They were told to save for the future while surviving the present. Raise children, help aging parents, pay the mortgage, recover from recessions, absorb medical bills, and somehow, still build a retirement account large enough to survive decades. But many looked at the numbers and saw a cliff. Not a beach house, not a golden watch, Not the peaceful ending they were promised. Just the question of how long they could keep working before their body, their industry, or their luck gave out. So when people ask why Gen X seems distant, remember this. Some of them are not dreaming about retirement. They are quietly calculating how expensive it will be to grow old. After years of being needed, Gen X did not explode. They simply got quieter. They stopped answering every call. They stopped explaining why they were tired. They stopped attending gatherings where love felt like obligation. They stopped chasing friendships that only survived when they made the effort. At work, they stopped giving pieces of themselves that were never coming back. Online, they muted the noise, the arguments, the outrage, and the performance. To some people, it looked cold. To Gen X, it felt like breathing. This was not revenge. It was not drama. It was not a midlife crisis. It was a boundary arriving late. When Gen X cuts people off, it often happens without announcement. A shorter reply, a missed holiday, a phone turned face down, a life becoming smaller, quieter, and finally more honest. They are not always cutting people off because they hate them. Sometimes, they are cutting off the version of themselves that kept saying yes while falling apart. Gen X is not cutting people off because they stopped caring. In many cases, they cared too long without being cared for in return. They kept showing up until showing up started costing them their peace. They answered calls that left them emptier. They kept relationships alive that only moved when they pushed. They swallowed disappointment and called it maturity. They accepted loneliness and called it privacy. But the body keeps score in quiet ways. The chest tightens. The patience disappears. The messages feel heavier than they should. And one day, silence becomes the only place where they can breathe. This is not coldness. This is self-preservation from people, places, and patterns that kept taking more than they gave. Gen X is not always closing the door to punish anyone. Sometimes, they are closing it because they finally realized peace is allowed. What Gen X wants now is not complicated. They are not asking to be rescued. They are not looking for applause. They do not need another person telling them to be strong. They have been strong for most of their lives. What they want is a relationship that does not feel like another job. A phone call that is not only a request. A conversation where they are not the fixer. A room where they can be quiet without being judged. Someone who notices when they are tired before they disappear. Someone who asks, and actually stays for the answer. They want to be chosen when nothing is broken. They want love that does not arrive disguised as responsibility. They want peace without having to earn it through exhaustion. And maybe, more than anything, they want permission to stop performing okay. Because beneath the silence is not a cold heart. It is a person who still wants connection, but only where they can finally be human. For decades, Gen X chased almost nothing for themselves. They chased stability. They chased the bills. They chased the next shift, the next deadline, the next family emergency. They chased approval from people who called their silence strength. They chased peace for responsibility, hoping one day the weight would finally get lighter. But now, something has changed. They are no longer chasing every call. No longer chasing every explanation. No longer chasing people who only remember them when life gets hard. This does not mean they stopped loving. It means they stopped abandoning themselves to prove they could be loved. Maybe this is why their silence feels so loud. Because the generation that spent a lifetime showing up is finally asking one question. What happens if I stop showing up for people who never showed up for me? And maybe that is not the end of General X. Maybe that is the beginning of their peace.